Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this online panel session, part one of the One Basin CRC series addressing key topics in the MDBA's Basin Plan Review discussion paper. My name is Bernadette Torrison and I'm the One Basin CRC Griffith Hub Manager. Today's session is titled Empowered Local Communities, and I'm delighted to have you join us as we talk through two main themes. One, making local voices count, and two, local governance, institutional enablers and new models. Welcome to country. We acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the Murray-Darling Basin and their nations. Today, I am joining you from Wiradjuri country, and I pay my respects to their elders and to the elders of all basin nations, past, present and emerging. Before we dive in, I'd like to cover a little background on the One Basin for those who may be new to our work. Our vision and purpose. The One Basin CRC is an industry and research collaboration established to tackle significant and complex water-related challenges in the Murray-Darling Basin. Our vision is for Australia's irrigation regions to be the most productive, resilient and sustainable in the world. Our purpose is to work together to grow value from water in a changing world. We bring together more than 85 organisations spanning industry, government, research and community. A range of our partners can be seen on the screen. Now, just some housekeeping. We do have questions and we warmly encourage questions and discussion. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions throughout the session, and we will address at the end if we have time. Please advise the name of the panellists you are directing your question to. Whatever questions can't be answered today, we will endeavour to get back to you. Recording. Today's sessions will be recorded. The recording, along with the recordings of all other panel sessions, will be made available through the One Basin Review Hub on our website in the next coming weeks. Now let's get started. I'm delighted to introduce today's panel. National President at Murray-Darling Association and at Griffith City Council, Shari Bloomer. National Irrigators Council, CEO, Zara Lowitt. Research Fellow, Monash Business School, Michael Spencer. Albury City Council Mayor, Kevin Mack. Principal at Water Trust Australia, Chris Cumming. CEO, Grounded Futures, and One Basin CRC Regional Advisory Committee Griffith Chair, Edwina Hayes. Michelle Ramsey is a Northern Basin community member, farmer and consultant, river lover, and currently working with Water Trust Australia in the Lower Bellona. And Senior Lecturer, Charles Sturt University, Jonathan Howard. We start off with our theme one, making local voices count. How can we better empower communities in basin management? Chris, thinking of a more collaborative future, in your opinion, how can we better enable communities to have access to power and influence in basin decisions?
Thanks, Bernadette. Really important question. I've got some thoughts on solutions, but before I give an answer, I've been given a bit of a remit, as you know, today to do a bit of context setting for this panel session. So I'm just going to start with that. So firstly, a definition of community. For the purposes of today, we're defining community as those individuals, groups, organisations, stakeholders in a regional or local area who are impacted by or have an interest in water decisions. The question part of better enabled obviously means a shift from now to a more enabled or empowered future. So I'm just going to remind ourselves, what does community look like now? So we all know power and influence is uneven and inconsistent. It's depending on what is in place locally and on the processes that each agency is choosing to engage on the water decisions they are making. So how does it look different? Local looks different based on states. So the approaches to local and their arrangements and the resourcing they have. There's regional agency unevenness in the capacity, remit, the interests and networks supported by regional scale organisations. So there I'm thinking like councils, CMAs, First Nation organisations and mobs, regional development sort of organisations. There's variation in bespoke organisations, so the number, types and capacity and power and influence vary in place. So climate change collectives, land cares, farming systems groups, industry organisations, leadership forums. There's variation arrangements established by decision makers. So environmental water advisory groups, drought hubs, land and water management plans, steering committees, MDBA regional committees. And on top of all that, community power and influence varies based on factors like individual local leaders, the strength of local connections at place, the shared understanding of patch, the water literacy at place, who's got access to resources, to the knowledge, to the politicians, to the evidence, to the collective deliberation, who's marginalised. So that's community. It's messy, it's crowded in some places, it's empty in others, it's inconsistent. It can be repetitive, it can be inefficient when it comes to water decision making. So it's not easy for communities or decision makers who are on board with greater influence and power to actually say, how do we do this? Access to power and influence also depends on the processes that an agency or section within an agency has chosen to engage in for decision making and the time and resources they've got at their disposal. So sometimes decision makers will try to navigate with what's there and work within. Sometimes they'll create their own bespoke arrangements, which can add to the complexity. They can do processes, anything from an online survey to independently led deliberation. Most often, community are asked for their views and they're listened to, and then decisions happen behind closed doors, possibly with what we heard at the end. When that happens, we don't get position shifting, we don't get new solutions necessarily emerging. Decisions can be contested after the event and processes can be deemed unfair. And we know consistently that communities are saying they feel reactive, over-consulted yet under-informed, fatigued, in silos, behaving as advocates or lobbyists rather than deliberators and solution finders, undervalued, underutilised. So my view is we can and must find better ways of working. These bespoke, fragmented, uneven models aren't actually helping us now, and they're not going to be fit for the increasingly complex contested decisions as water becomes scarcer. So I'm focused on two areas that I think would better enable greater community involvement in decision making. Firstly, that's the decision processes. With increased commitment and intent and an increase in capability and an understanding of how to design and deliver better decision processes, I think we can shift from communities providing siloed input to being involved in developing solutions. And there are ways to do this, many tried and tested, and also new knowledge around how we incorporate concepts of equity and fairness and those sorts of things. I think the second way is a focus on local ways of working and local governance. There's work needed with governments, stakeholders, communities on ways of working better together, governance frameworks. And I think we need to collectively engage in processes to consider local governance opportunities that may be layered and might include formal and informal arrangements. Thanks, Bernadette.
Thank you, Chris. That's fantastic. Michael, if I can direct to yourself, what institutional challenges are hindering community authority, and what would collaborative design look like?
Thanks, Bernie, and thanks for having me. The basin's always been run in a very top-down hierarchical way from its inception as a mechanism for development of the inland waterways of Australia right through most of the 20th century, when it was run by engineers who knew best and were creating these economic development opportunities through the inland waterways. And that bred a contested system where, as these communities developed more power, they contested those decisions. But it's very adversarial. It's controlled from the top with resistance from the communities fighting for their position. And they've been willing to use that power politically. we get locked into these ways of working. I think that's quite well known, and we react in a manner that we have always done. So it's going to require a step change to break out of these ways of thinking. So how do we create a future based on collaboration, both within the communities and between the communities, because we've got all the upstream, downstream issues as well. The first part is a commitment to change. And that commitment to change needs to be shown through the development of this plan. We need communication, we need trust, we need to be prepared to devolve responsibility, which is a key part of trust. Trust isn't just something you say, it's something you do. So we need the various governments to be prepared to devolve responsibility to communities, and those communities need to build shared values rather than just a sense of I'm fighting for my community. It's what are the values we all share as a community and through the basin. And based on that, there's plenty of work, and I'll come back to this later perhaps, around collaborative governance and the management of what is traditionally called a common pool resource, which is what we have in the basin, which we need to be able to manage collectively. And I think we've gone as far as we can in managing it in a top-down way.
Yep, fantastic. Thanks, Michael. Sarah, just directing a question to you. From how can we better include farmers within the basin plan process? So which decisions would farmers co-lead or jointly own? And if we devolved one decision type today to farmers, what would it be?
I think what we're hearing from, the other panelists too is about devolving decision-making, probably from a top-down approach down from a local ground-up approach back the other way. And so that includes farmers, as it does a whole range of stakeholders that love where they live. The importance in devolving decision-making down to the local level is about ensuring they can have their own backyard opinion, but that also of the scale, whether that's the broader catchment scale or the broader basin scale. And that's where you need other forums where you can have those joint discussions. And so farmers often are the few stakeholders that have localised groups that might scale up to state groups or coordinated regional groups, then scale up to an organisation like ours that is across the basin and broader. And so that gives them different perspectives, so they help shape their positions at a local with that kind of appreciation. But generally speaking, farmers, their office is their backyard. And so I find if you can go out on the ground and have that opportunity, that's where they're best at solving problems. But to do that too, in any localised, devolved decision-making process needs to have a clear problem definition. And that's where we've seen some of the challenges in making decisions in the past is a lack of clarity of what we're trying to achieve. So I think going forward, if they could jointly, and I don't think it's a farmer-only decision model, I think is farmers together with other stakeholders in their community that have a multi-level perspective, they can really solve the wicked problems at a local scale, and hopefully we can scale those up further. So I think that's where we should try and start once we've got a clear local problem that they need to resolve.
Great. Thank you, Zara. Michelle, it would be good to hear your opinions on different options when the future includes us. From your perspective, what does a one table, shared need, shared journey look like?
Thanks, Penny. I feel like Chris and Michael and Zara all provided really useful comments to feed into mine. And I firstly want to acknowledge that the work MDBA is doing and has done in investing in the evidence base and in our relationships across the basin. And I feel like now is the room for the gold or the value from all of that, which we're not getting to, again, partly because of this lack of forum for devolved decision-making and allowing that localised generation of options. So the current engagement processes, and also, as Zara said, the lack of a specific problem definition means we're not having that iterative process of cross-testing ideas and options that can scale up to upstream and downstream benefits. So essentially, we are missing out on opportunities for the environment and First Nations, I think, especially in the Northern Basin, and finding those options that can deliver less pain to communities and agriculture. Everyone talks about trade-offs, and really I think it's important that we're around the table discussing those as options are being generated, including people that are going to be bearing trade-offs, understanding them and being involved in any progress of options. So there's this absence that we've spoken about of the opportunity for diverse interests to come together. I'm specifically seeing opportunities at the more local level, and I understand it's a big shift for MDBA to look at devolving some of that decision making, but I think data and the plan's progress to date, and Michael said it, we've gone as far as we can really in progressing options that are going to deliver more benefits, and it's really imperative that we switch to this other more iterative process where we can test our ideas and options. So that one table shared journey is referring to that process of building and bringing all different diverse interests along in a shared understanding of the problem and the evidence base, and having us all aiming for a common need, and then testing and modifying our options together. So yeah, that's my point at the moment.
Great, thank you, Michelle. Edwina, if I could just ask you a question. So in your opinion, how might we better manage trade-offs fairly across communities?
I think here I'd really like to touch on, a number of things that the other panellists have discussed. And I think referring to Michael's institutional challenges, I think that embedding local communities and their governance agents in assessing and determining trade-offs and advising on acceptable impacts and co-designing adaptive pathways into the plan is one of the ways that we can make a definitive step to including local community governance and empowering local communities in an institutional way. In terms of, I think, Michelle mentioned, trade-offs are, quite definitive and can be polarising. I really think focusing on transitions, movement of enterprises, from one to another, and aligning compensation, support and incentives to adapt within the existing impacted stakeholders, focusing on climate change adaptation and, increasing water scarcity and the issues, the wicked issues, but also, I guess, building in the community's say-so on the community that is impacted, their say-so on what's happening. I think formally measuring and transparently weighting all the aspects of the criteria used to assess the trade-offs, what's been traded in giving local communities, the governance agents of local communities, giving them a formal place in decision-making is, a really significant step forward in terms of empowerment. Acknowledging local community governance as a core pillar of the plan involves treating that knowledge as formal evidence and resourcing inclusive decision-making structures, and not interpreting community input as narrative and case study, and denying it that formal place in the decision-making of the authority.
Great, thanks for the input, Edwina. Turning our focus to the second theme, local governance, institutional enablers and new models. This isn't about winners or losers, it's about transparent, accountable choices. Let's take a look at how can councils be better included into the basin process, and which decisions should councils co-lead or jointly own, and if devolved one decision type today to councils, what would it be? I open the floor to Kevin and Shari. Kevin, would you like to start off with your advice on that? Just on mute, I believe, Kevin.
I think Shari should. She's the lead.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I think thanks for the question, Bernie. I think I want to pick up and move back to the other points about from Michael and Zara and Edwina about devolving responsibility. So at a local government level, we would love to have some responsibility devolved to us, but the funding will need to be devolved as well. And because what happens is in our communities, we get sort of state and federal bureaucrats coming to us and technical experts coming to us after sort of 4 years and 40 FTE of consideration about these really difficult issues. And we're very far behind in that journey of learning and capacity. And so then they come out here with these great ideas and great decisions, and our community is simply not there, and we're simply not there. And so what we would ask is that when these kind of projects, specifically under the basin, are being considered, that we're there as at the beginning. And I think that the Commonwealth's going to need to take a bigger lead in that in their deal memos, because if you're looking at devolving responsibility and you're looking about governance, we will not be included at a local government level unless unless the states are forced to include us. Due to the Constitution, as you all know, we don't get any money, we can't get money given directly to us, and there's no need, and we don't have a space in the water space. So I suppose what I would ask is that if this was something that people thought was important, I think it's important. I think council is best placed to talk to our communities, and that's at all levels because we do it every day. But we're going to need to be included from the beginning, and we're going to need to go on those journeys to create those solutions. And we're going to need to insist that when those MOUs are being drafted or those deal memos, that consideration of funding for local government to capacity build to be joint leads or jointly own those are considered at that point, because by the time it trickles down to us, there's no money left. People have made decisions, and they've developed a lot of expertise that we don't have in those sort of specialist areas.
Thank you, Shari. Kevin, would you like to add to that?
Oh, look, as the former chair of the Riverina Murray Joint Organisation, we did a water paper that was Southern Basin based, and there was no political motivation. It was impartial and certainly provided a view to the government, and it was warmly received by the MDBA and the states. However, what we find is that the competition they create, and to Michael's point, there's that many de facto organisations that get involved, and basically the common thread here is the local government. They want us to do their bidding when they require us to support them, but when we have any opinion, it's just they've got an opinion and there's no legal connection to it. And if you think about how many times the Water Act, I think was started in 1912, you've got 5 states fighting over water, and essentially the government doesn't know what to do about that because they can't get them in alignment. And as councils, I think across Australia, we need to think about how we can regionally address this as an entity, not as individuals, because if we keep going at it as individuals, that's not going to achieve any outcome. And I think for this, we're a dry country, and certainly productivity in this country, 80 to 90% of it comes from the regions, yet we've got no say. I think, it's about getting that voice in the regions to speak louder and certainly say it's not just about water, it's about everything. And then everything flows. I think that really is the translation, and people's apathy towards politics is just beguiling, because they just see what they see on television. I think, well, what's the point? But through local government, they can have a voice, but through a bigger entity, evolving it through the whole regional capitals of Australia or regions of Australia gives you a much bigger voice, because productivity, you can't lie about it, because that's where they get all their money and their taxes, and certainly that's how we run this country. And mining, agriculture provide a significant percentage of that, and water is required in every process. And I think, again, speak to the money, don't speak to the feeling, and you'll get reactions, because the political parties rely upon these organisations to fund their campaigns. I think really regions need to stand up and have a bigger voice about that.
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Shari. Really good points. So to the two of you again, just looking at local legitimacy and representation, from your perspective, how can councils be better empowered as regional integrators?
Well, that's to the point I made. I think, again, they need to be empowered to believe they've got a voice in the first place. And the only way to do that is to partner with big organisations like big mining, like big agriculture, like the big heavy hitters that are actually lone voices in a big sea. And I think, again, if the government creates, particularly in the space of water, you've got DQ overseeing MDBA, and there's a confusion there that the MDBA are the masters. DQ are the masters. They own the largest proportion of water. The climate water is far greater than what we see in terms of the basin water that's given to agricultural irrigators. DQ are the masters. They've got wonderful, wonderful research, as was mentioned before by Michelle, but it's what they do with that research and how that applies to all of Australia, not just parts of Australia. And again, that was mentioned as well. I mean, there seems to be a bent on environment and culture now. That's another added component of the water plan. But the reality is, where's the balance in that discussion? And that's what I mean. You've got to engage those people who have the power, have the money, and work with them, because as local government, we can't do it. We don't have the power to do it. We can certainly bring people together, but it's all a talk fest.
Yeah, so I've got a slightly different view to that, in that I think that council already are regional integrators, and we're already managing a huge amount in the infrastructure and policy space, and we still get treated like third class citizens. So I'll just use an example. For the purposes of advocacy, Griffith City Council put together a water prospectus to actually talk about what we managed. And I'm going to give you an example of some of the things that local government manage, because a lot of people, especially who aren't in regional areas, and this is not saying for all of the states, it's a New South Wales issue, but we manage a whole heap of infrastructure. So we currently 14,488 megalitres, and are directly responsible for potable water treatment, sewage treatment, and stormwater management. We're also the manager of Lake Wyangan, Griffith's primary water body for recreational use, which provides habitat to numerous species of birds in Campbell's wetland and Nerrican wetland land. To manage the potable water treatment, we have developed Griffith Drinking Water Management System, providing a comprehensive framework to manage the supply of safe potable water to city residents. We also have $58.6 million in our water fund to finance future capital works required to manage the Griffith Water Treatment Plant and Griffith Water Reclamation Plant. And then we provide approximately 5 megalitres per day to the Barron Box Swamp with associated environmental benefits. So this is a significant investment of time and resources already. And we think we deserve to be treated as a major player locally in the water space, because we are actually delivering a huge amount. And I would also put that challenge to some of our state governments to ask them how much are they actually delivering out here in the basin, and why do they get a better seat at the table than we as local government? And that's not even talking about our irrigation corporations and what they do out here. And so that's probably much larger than us, but I still want to point out at a local level how significant our work is and the capability of our organisations.
Thank you, Shari. Jonathan, if I could ask you, how could we avoid fragmentation along the basin and ensure justice, variations and inclusions in a more effective manner?
Thanks, Bernadette. This is a really difficult question to answer to some degree, because we're talking about a massive amount of land and a massive amount of water. It's a huge, the Murray, the Murrumbidgee and the Darling are the three largest rivers in Australia. So even though it's complex, I think that there's no one size fits all in all this process. There's a set of two things that Chris and I guess Michael touched on earlier that really need to be the foundation of what we're talking about. One is subsidiarity. That means we go down to the lowest level possible within the decision-making session. And the other one is agency. So who has agency? Who has the power to make decisions and so on? I think Kevin and the local government perspective, we're talking a bit about, well, they have some power and they have some talk, but they don't get the voice in that particular conversation around that. Once we start with those foundations of subsidiarity and agency, then the thing is we've got to unpack the issues, because water is a very agnostic resource, can be used for everything from spraying off the driveway to actually your own survival. So that depends on the issue that we're focused on, and that means we need to look at the scale, the context, and the lifetime that issue goes for. So, for example, an issue like salinity would go for a very much longer time than something like the rehabilitation of a wetland. So scale, context, and lifetime needs to be the next considerations. And then once we've focused on the issue, we can then start to think about the organisations that need to be involved and the properties that they need to have. And there's probably 8 different properties that these organisations would have. And as Chris was saying earlier, it could be a range of different agencies. First of all, you have to ask, have they got the capability to attack the issue? Are they seen as legitimate within the community, and are they legitimate to the government above them? Can they be held accountable for the issue? What level of integration can they play? So that's mixing land and water. We shouldn't just focus on just add water, even though as the Murray-Darling Basin Authority has said in its early paper, it's not just add water, we need to have integrated management. There needs to be a level of transparency with the community. And given that we're talking about wicked problems here, there needs to be a level of adaptivity going forward so that we can change and be a bit more agile as we move along. And then when we're talking about the local community and getting the local people involved, there's 2 principles about inclusiveness and fairness that needs to be operated within those agencies. Now, that fairness is really hard to unpack because people see fairness in very different ways, but you can divide it up in terms of a framework of either distributive fairness, which is that stuff about, well, who gets a certain amount of the pie, and we can think of 50-50 or 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And the other one is procedural, which is really what the local government perspective was talking about, and that is then they don't seem to have a voice. But there's a process within that decision-making process where we have to think about procedures all the way through. So who do we recognise? Do we recognise First Nations people? Do we recognise recreational fishers? Well, some would say probably not as much as we do irrigators or primary producers and so on. Then the next stage is about voice. So who has the voice? As you heard Kevin Mack say, he feels, and the Griffith Council person say, local government feel that they don't have a voice, even though they're producing these papers. Then there's the decision-making process. Who gets what, and is it negotiated as being fair? Now, I can take a lesser slice of the cake if I feel that somebody actually deserves it more. And then the final one is who's doing the enforcing. Now, we've got the Inspector General and we've got NRR and all those sort of things, but it's important that once we make that decision-making process and we're decided that this is where we're going to head, that there's some process of tracking that. And I guess that goes back to transparency, but it's also going back to policing and legislation. So they're the sort of performance outcomes that we need to think about in terms of fairness and inclusiveness when we go forward with this greater level of community involvement.
Yeah. Great, thanks for that, Jonathan. Chris, so building on the capabilities, so what capability and coordination is needed to support greater community decision involvement along the basin?
Yeah, thanks, Bernie. And I'm going to pick up again on my points from earlier, that focusing on decision processes and local governance, and talk to each of those. We can, as we have for many years, talk about all of this, but going from the conversations to actually how you put it in practice is actually going to require some concentrated effort and some deliberation and working together. So I think I'm talking to some of the things that I think we can do in the shorter term. So the embedding better and fairer decision processes, the first one. First, there's a mind shift capability piece there for water decision makers. And I mean that, with all due respect, but we really need decision makers to actually want this and to create the opportunities for increased power and influence of communities in being part and informing decision processes that ultimately government as decision makers will decide on. We want them to try different ways. We want them to really value the expertise and knowledge held by communities. And there's a whole trust piece about being trustworthy, but also trusting in new and different ways of making decisions. It's going to take leadership, and it's going to, and that leadership's got to require and enable practice change. And then there's sort of legislative opportunities and guides and all those things that need to raise the intent, set the goal higher, build the momentum for an expectation of better ways of working. For communities, I think one of the real challenges for communities is we've been locked in a position of advocates and moving into a position of being those that are also solution finders and making decisions. That's a big shift, and it's going to actually, it has a lot of responsibility around that, because suddenly you're having to consider a range of values and perspectives, and as well as your own interests. And that's not everyone's going to want that role, but that's going to be something for communities to, be mindful of. All of this is practice change, and like any practice change, it needs support on how we deliberate on issues, access to guides and materials that will help with that. Support about the inclusion of fairness. We've been doing a lot of work at Water Trust on this. How do you bring fairness into the processes? And I like the way Jonathan talked about distributed fairness and procedural fairness. There's a lot of work and information we can be providing to enable that. Trials and examples, pilots, workshops, conferences. There's a practice change piece here, and I think we can really start moving on that. With regional governance, to consider this, we need to work together with communities, governments, local stakeholders. We've got to explore what are fair and layered governance opportunities that are going to establish ways of working that are going to deliver to multiple goals, both of communities and governments. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we come up with something that actually warrants resourcing, because it's going to improve the way decisions are being made? Some of the things I think that these frameworks should be able to address is enable holistic consideration of issues. Water's just part of a system. Enable collective regional knowledge and understanding. Enable access to science and data in a way that's relevant to the decisions being made and the local patch. Enable future-looking lenses instead of reactive. Enable us to bring in values and perspectives and really understand them in a shared way in terms of the decision and the region. They've got to allow for deliberation and knowledge sharing, and they've got to be a win-win that be useful for communities and for governments. Basically what I'm saying is, let's work together, find some local governance options, test them, and if they've actually got legs, let's resource them and give it a go.
Yep.
Thank you.
Well, Chris, thank you. Michael, let's think in terms of delegation, joint governance, shared operating models. What are some pragmatic changes in your view?
Well, we're talking about the basin plans and the revision of the basin plan. So the first thing that needs to happen is there needs to be a clear commitment made that we're going to change. And then there needs to be an understanding that changing 150 years, 100 years of practice doesn't happen, with the click of someone's fingers. So what we need to build into that plan is a step process for devolution of responsibility to a local level. So acknowledgement that this is the direction we're going to go, and then a step process for introducing that. And that also needs to be the product of a collaborative process. It's not a bunch of public servants saying, here's the plan. I think there needs to be quite a bit of consultation. And I think part of that is going to be we need to establish local governance entities at a local level. So we need to create the sorts of entities at a local level that include all the relevant stakeholders. Now, in a lot of communities, the basis for this will already exist. You know, irrigators, local government, business, you know, in bushwalkers, all sorts of people work together loosely already. So they may vary from community to community, but the principles need to be established in terms of, you know, what are the rules? So what are we trying to achieve with these local entities, and how do we expect them to operate? But the actual organising they may do themselves, because each local community will be different. But we need to also give those local organisations real responsibility. So these aren't just, oh yeah, and we'll consult you when we feel like it. They are to have real responsibility to make real decisions, and, to echo Shari, have the resources and the capabilities to do that. Because, you know, what we see from government and you know, in the area I've been working on recently on climate adaptation, we've got lots of plans, all of which point to, you know, local government and local communities as having all these responsibilities for adaptation, but no resources. So we can't not resource that. And it can't be the normal way of just, oh, we're going to allow you to submit for project funding, because, you know, that's not a very productive long-term way of doing things either. So we've got to be prepared to do things differently. We've got to be prepared to make a commitment to local decision making. We've got to find the mechanisms to do it, and we've got to resource that and give it the responsibility. And then on top of that, going to the overall basin strategy and direction, we need to create further governance mechanisms to bring these together, so that the basin as a whole is moving in the same direction. We don't want to create these local organisations that simply create upstream, downstream battles or whatever. We need to have the mechanism there. But it's going to be a staged process. It's going to need a clear commitment in the next iteration of the plan, and a stepped plan for implementation. Thanks, Bernard.
Thank you, Michael. Edwina, should productivity, socioeconomic and sociocultural impacts be explicit in decisions? And what do you think is missing in current impact assessments?
Thanks, Bernie. Yes, absolutely. Productivity, socioeconomic and sociocultural impacts should be explicit in decisions. And I'm going to go back to earlier points that I do think we might be labouring points here, you know, saying the same things, but it is, you know, in terms of the revision of the plan, I think it's critical that that community governance agents have a voice. So current impact assessments use hydrological modelling and regional economic modelling, and a very complex evaluation assessment that's not fixed or transparent. So fixing some of those things fixing those things into the plan or into the formal evidence gathering for decisions on impact, you know, is critical to moving forward with a sense of fairness and inclusion for local communities. Currently, lived experience and local evidence is treated as, you know, contextual narrative against the formal evidence of hydrological and socioeconomic, regional, like large scale, broad evidence. So that bringing it down to the subsidiarity, bringing the subsidiarity down in the plan is critical to having good impact assessments. Requiring place-based evidence in all assessments and not treating the plan and impact assessments in terms of, you know, starting at the broad scale, but starting at the small scale and building that up so that we don't, you know, overlook critical areas of productivity and socioeconomic and sociocultural impacts. writing local community governance into the authority, so governance agents into the authority is part of that. Building shared place-based stewardship of adaptations and transitions by including local community governance agents. And when I refer to local community governance agents, I'm particularly referring to groups like Landcare, irrigators, local government authorities, the local chapters of industry and peak bodies and farming systems groups, even the CWA, local groups that have intimate knowledge alongside their First Nations, state and federal stakeholders together in the decision-making process. Having that not necessarily the same in every place, but having it clear and transparent that if we're going to use, this set or subset of the multi-evaluation indicators, that the community understands and knows what those are. I think that with subsidiarity and authoritative local agency, we'll be strengthening the social acceptability of the plan, we'll be improving realism in the policy delivery and building sustainable human and economic resilience across the basin. So we'll be in a much better position to deliver basin outcomes in a way that local communities feel like they belong and like they've been heard, and that it's fair.
Yeah. Thanks, Edwina. Great points. Zara, in your opinion, what would convince farmers that their voices are genuinely shaping the basin decisions?
I think I just have to point to Edwina's comments, to be honest. I think, again, farmers are a group of stakeholders that are as equally as important as many others at a local level. And so when you go through a process that brings them along from the beginning, I think the challenge we have in this model is, the acceptance of it from a decision-making point of view, and realising the scope of where local solutions can provide an answer versus those that might be at a different scale. And that's that understanding the different levels of input and the different objectives at a local versus catchment versus regional, whether that be Southern Basin and then basin scale. So I'm kind of, there is a process that you go to appreciate that. And for farmers and any stakeholder to feel like they're genuinely shaping a decision and see is they've got to inform themselves and be part of it. And this proposal for a ground up approach rather than a top down is definitely one way where we think people will feel much more heard and listened to, because they should see the evidence and the outcomes from their effort, because they'll get to start working together to implement those solutions, particularly when we start them at the ground up. The challenge, and I feel like I'm a broken record, is then these great examples which we have of some of this happening, how do we scale them? How do we scale them up further beyond just our local reach of the river or our local community? And that's the challenge I see in front of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority now, given a strong push and we've seen the evidence of inflexibility in the past plan. How do we take on the great partnerships and collaborations and where people have felt heard better and scale that up as a process going forward? I think it can be done, but we probably have to give some real evidence of how that happens and see the genuine outputs of that. So I kind of answer in the sense, not just farmers in this one, Bernadette, as we keep talking, it's all of us that love our communities and how we love and how that adds up to love our basin as well and what we want for its future.
Absolutely, indeed. And actually, I'll just ask a quick question, and anyone can answer this. Is there an example that we can give where a bottom-up approach has actually happened and we've seen it work? Has anyone got something they'd like to share in terms of where that whole structure has worked in this water space?
I could give a quick example if you'd like, Bernadette, firstly, while others think. One example where we've seen an issue pop up and it happens at both low water quality and high water quality, but it's using irrigation infrastructure, which was purpose-built to deliver water to grow agriculture, right? But the issue was we've had low dissolved oxygen or whatever it might mean, and going to those irrigation infrastructure operators who might have outlets and say, if we move environmental water or additional water through that system and release it, we can actually create an opportunity to improve water quality downstream or near that offshoot. And we saw that with Murray Irrigation having done that. And that's one example of when you really clearly know the problem and you can ask people around and farmers what the solution might be. They would never have thought to use irrigation infrastructure in that purpose in the past. And now that can be an option to go forward as a case study of what else can be done in the event that that happens again, because it probably will happen. We'll always get black water events or low water quality events, given the nature of Australia. So it's now asking that question of how we can think differently about the infrastructure we have. And that's one example of where that's been a solution. Using networks to deliver water onto private wetlands, for example, is another. We're growing this kind of understanding better and better now when we're clearer at what the problems are locally of what we're trying to solve.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Edwina?
And regions being regions, I guess I'd like to add to that the add-on there of building the tourism aspect of, like, the transition tourism aspect of those wetlands being watered, really added a lot of value at a time when tourism was under a lot of pressure, post-COVID lockdown. So, it really, that does demonstrate one of those examples of layer upon layer of local evidence, local place-based knowledge, and, feeding that into wider systems that really, made some new economic opportunities and, solved a lot of problems.
Brilliant. Thank you. Jonathan, you'd like to add something?
Yeah, I just want to give a shout out to the Northeast Sustainability Alliance. It's a ragtag group, if that's the right word, of people with a diverse range of issues and interests, ranging from the elderly to the young. It includes local government, and they sequence with state government in terms of endangered fish, in terms of climate change, a whole range of other things. It's really a quite unique functioning partnership between a diversity of community groups or people with different issues who are now working together to resolve the challenge of integrated management in just across the river in Victoria.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. And Michael? Oh, just on mute, Michael.
Sorry. When I was working with water stewardship, we worked with the Renmark Trust, which is a similar story. So they were looking at collaboration and building the sustainability and health of their area, and of course, as many of you would know, developed partnership with for environmental watering and so on, but actually contributed to the rehabilitation of a wetland, which increased the tourism opportunities and the sustainability and built a greater bond. And talking to them recently, they're now looking to that as a marketing opportunity. So I think we're seeing quite a bit there. On the other hand, there was a great case study that I was just looking for from when the Water Act was introduced in New South Wales, where one of the communities, and some of the people on the call might know which one, put in a heck of a lot of work to respond to the requirement for developing a long-term watering plan that was then overruled by the government that said, we'll make the decisions. And that then, caused a huge flow on back into that community that then felt completely disillusioned. So I think communities have shown they can do this and make it work. Often though, well, certainly in that case study, they've been frustrated because government has then slammed the door in their face when they've tried to come up with collective solutions. So there are examples, and they're very good examples. But they're only going to work, and they're only going to find their way through if there's participation at all levels, not just the community doing these things.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Michael. Michelle? Just on mute, Michelle.
Sorry, Bernie, bit of a delay. I feel like the Northern Basin Toolkit measures that came out of a review of how much water was required for the environment back in 2012, before the basin plan was finalised. That led to some consideration and generation of options that couldn't have come forward apart from the fact that there were local people with local knowledge from across the Northern Basin involved. And then now I'm having, I guess I feel fortunate to be able to have followed that through to working in the Lower Balonne with Water Trust, where we're exploring options that can actually make a difference to those lowest flow, no flow periods. And, then they're not in the basin plan. There's things happening already that aren't able to be accounted, like use of private storages to store water for later release. There was a bird breeding event that was supported at Narran Lakes that was trialled by the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder with Cubby Station, I understand. And we're just looking at more and more of those options that stand to have so much more impact on the problem, as Zara says. Let's define the problem. And if the problem is those lowest flow periods and connectivity, how can we have the biggest impact on them? It may not be buying more permanent water out of communities and the agriculture sector. And another example that we're looking at and modelling at the moment with Water Trust funding is the potential to, even buy out a small event on a voluntary basis, leading into a really dry time. It's exciting to see the modelling on these things, and some of them may or may not end up being of use, but it's the process that is the important thing, where a cross-section of stakeholders are sitting in a room together, generating options, and all want to see progress on this common problem of tackling those really low flow periods in their part of the world.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Michelle. I'm going to open to a point of view for all panellists now with this question. So if there was one thing we wanted to see come out of this review in terms of community and local governance empowerment, what would it be? Who would like to have a go at answering that first up? Jonathan?
I would just say that the point that I started to talk about and Edwina talked about, which was about changing to subsidiarity as a founding principle. Going down to the lowest layers is a really critical first thing, and thinking that first and saying, right, that's our priority is an important thing.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add? Yeah. Who do we have next?
I think I'm up. Thanks, Bernie. I guess I would just add to that to actually make it a formal part of the plan revision and not a statement that can be loosely or otherwise followed up on, but actually having it written in formally.
Great. Thanks, Edwina. Kevin?
Yeah, look, thanks, Bernadette. I think it was mentioned before, if they're going to implement a plan, we need, and really you can't, it's been around for a long time, but you need to see incremental improvement, and they need to demonstrate that to the stakeholders, because otherwise it's hidden from view. I think if you can see incremental improvement in what they're offering or trading in, then you have a greater belief in the product. I just think that in the past, it's just been a bit hit and miss, and it's been a political football that too scared to actually address. And listen to Andrew, he seems to want to address it, but is there political will? We'll see.
Thanks, Kevin. Chris?
Yeah, I think the things that we're talking about very relevant to the basin plan, but also relevant to the the implementation of that plan to the DQ-led other water reforms that are happening to the states. So there's only so much that the Basin Plan has the remit to cover. So when I look at the Basin Plan and what's in there, I think raise the bar, create higher expectation. Instead of saying listen to communities or consult with, talk about deliberate with, talk about work together to find solutions, you know, wherever you can. And it's all scattered throughout the plan, this reference to communities. Raise the bar on that reference. And if you can, include commitments to be looking at and working with governance arrangements that are developed with other stakeholders, with community, with other governments that are going to be fit for multiple purposes, but just wherever you can within the plan, build that expectation of wanting better.
Great, thank you, Chris. Michael or Zara?
Yeah, Zara, you go first.
might be me. I think someone selected me to be. That's all right. So I agree. I think the reshaping of the Basin Plan might be a process on how this could happen. So agree to some of the, you know, what's in and out of scope for what communities can help decide. And I think set up the framework in the Basin Plan to enable that. I think that's the challenge we've had with the past Basin Plan. It was so prescriptive of what the SIDLAM process was going to be. And look, we needed that for certainty because there was so many unknowns. But we've made such a step change now in terms of having water for the environment that wasn't there 15 years ago. It's now about how we get the most out of that. And for that, you're going to need partnerships. So you're going to have to enable a process to make that happen. And so I really want to see the next Basin Plan be a process or a management plan that enables that to happen across a range of themes for the environment and for communities, and testing, having some outcomes that you want to achieve, but testing and monitoring that and being adaptive, because we have seen a lot of lack of flexibility in the current one too, as more information or new issues arise, really limited on how we can solve them given the current legislative structure.
Thank you, Sarah. Michael?
Yeah, so as I was saying before, I think what we need to see in the plan is a firm commitment, supported by a step process. So not only, we're committed to this, but this is how we're going to do it. But at the end of the day, empowered communities wouldn't be feeling like they're on the outside looking in to this process. They'd feel like they were on the inside being part of the decision making. And that's a step change that we need and that needs to be accepted all the way up and down the tree.
Absolutely. And Shari?
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to repeat what everyone else has said, but remembering that communities used to do this before until the Basin Plan came in. So what we need in a new version of the Basin Plan is explicit language that calls out communities and their role in delivering outcomes for the basin, because it doesn't need to be complicated. It just needs to be explicit, because unfortunately it is not unfortunately, it is a legal framework. So if it's not explicit, it will be ignored. So what I'm saying is we need strong language about the roles that communities will play, and then we can deal with the frameworks can arise out of that.
Indeed. Thank you, Shari. Do we have anyone else on the panel that I have not seen? No? Fantastic. Look, I'm going to open, Michelle, thank you.
Sorry, Bernie, I always get a delay when I press my button. I guess looking short term, we're talking about the next Basin Plan, but I'd also love to see some responsiveness from MDBA post the 1st of May in this regard, in terms of how they handle what we've heard, and whether there's any opportunity for iterating and contesting that in local community forums moving forward through to the formation of the plan. I realise we're talking about step change, but at some point we have to take the first step, and I would just flag that for careful thought by the authority and its board for how they plan on addressing our ongoing concerns about not really being part of this basin plan that we're meant to be able to see ourselves in.
Yes, well said. Thank you, Michelle. I'm going to now open to the floor, inclusive of panellists. So please, to our viewers, if you wish to add your comment, please put it in the Q&A. The first question I'm asking everyone is, looking to the future, what do you think empowered communities looks like? Just your comment. It would be great to hear your point of view and to see what some of the major parts are. Yes, Zara?
I think it gets to the crux of what so much of we've been talking about here today is communities that feel listened and heard and are part of their own future direction rather than waiting for someone to tell them what that is. And I think that's across more things than just water, to be honest, living in a regional community. Not sitting waiting for the handout, being part of their own solutions and their direction, I think is ultimately where we all want to be. And water's a big part of that.
Great, thank you, Zara. Jonathan?
Yeah, I interpreted your question maybe slightly different than what Zara did. I think one of the outcomes that will happen as a result of this is you'll get vibrant, resilient communities. So that's what it would look like in the future. You know, I can imagine with those words that the community are interacting with each other. You've got a lot of social capital going on. I think it's a great destination to aspire to.
Thank you, Jonathan. Chris?
Yeah, I think to me an empowered community is one that has access to the information that enable them to really contribute and think about the decisions that are being made and what is best. They've got access to resources and time to deliberate on issues, that they're on the front foot, not reacting all the time. They're informing how decisions will be made when we're talking about these big water decisions. How do we want to make them, and what evidence do we need to consider them, and what's the process going to look like, and how are we going to make choices? They're all the things the community isn't involved in at the moment. They don't have a say over, and so often later we'll feel a process has been unfair. So I think an empowered community is one that is involved right from the beginning with governments on how we're going to approach these tricky issues together and how we're going to make the choices that we all need to be part of and own and are able to be carried forward.
Beautiful. Thank you, Chris. Edwina?
I think what everybody else said too first, but for me, the vision of an empowered community is one where there isn't, this sense of being used and used up. So cohesion, a sense of fairness. So enough of that information and strategy and broad thinking that local communities can feel like maybe they didn't get what they were advocating or lobbying for, but they feel like it was fair. And I think that sense of fairness and acceptance of fairness is where we would get that cohesion, that diversity of input, and the true resilience of the community as we move into increasing water scarcity and transitioning into different enterprises and different activities across the basin.
Yeah, thank you, Edwina. Is there anyone else that would like to add to that before I move on to the next? Yes, Michael?
Only Bernie, that I think we need to recognise in this that there's a reciprocal responsibility. So whilst there's a strong argument being made, and I've been part of it, about empowering communities by giving them or by providing them with both the agency and the capability to take responsibility for their own decisions, the flip side of that is the expectation that they would have a sense of responsibility for the whole as well. So it's not just about arguing for my patch. It's about sharing responsibility for the whole entity of the basin as well. And I think there's certainly been acceptance of that on this call, but it would be wrong not to note that on the way through, that that's part of this as well.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Michael. Sarah?
I think, apologies, I did crash out before, so hopefully that this isn't a repeating anything. But I think also it's upon communities to inform themselves of that different scale that Michael talks about and that I've kind of talked a bit about today, but to be really part of the decision and that to feel like you've been heard and part of the solutions, you've got to inform yourself on what the challenge is as well. And that's talking to others as well as reading the technical, and that can be hard. So I think there needs to be a lot of work by government to better empower and inform communities in that. And that could take a whole lot of different forms. We're very busy, everyone's busy. So how we do that and continue to grow and upskill so that we do get, the best solutions possible, or at least start with some solutions that we can improve upon as well. They're kind of 2 points that it's important. If community want this, they're going to have to work a little bit too. It's not a free, kick for them. They're going to have to actually, and they've got to accept and be willing to commit to that too. So it's a bit of a catch-all, but I think it's important to note that we've got to ask and empower them to be ready for that as well.
Thanks, Sarah. Moving along, I've got another question I'd like to ask. And again, this is to our panellists and also to our viewers. If there was one thing MDBA could adopt immediately that's been mentioned today, what would it be? And for our viewers, if you would like to put your answers in our Q&A, that would be fantastic. Our panellists, if there's someone who'd like to talk to that, the floor is yours. Edwina?
I think legislating community input and as formal evidence is something that's come up over and over.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to add to that, Chris? Well, you're on mute, Chris.
Yep. Sorry, thinking of one word, and I think that would be leadership. And DBA is a very visible part of the management of the basin, obviously, and are committed to hearing from community. But I think that real leadership in saying we are actually going to show the way in changing practice. We're going to point to it wherever we can in terms of that expectation around greater community involvement, local governance, all the things we've talked about. Take every opportunity to not only put it into their guides and their documents, but actually work with communities and stakeholders to find ways of doing this better and be on the front foot, show it can be done, build the momentum.
Yeah. Well done, thank you. Jonathan?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that the basin and its actions and everything goes on is really a partnership, because the states have ownership of natural resource management. They own the water, they own the land, and do the planning and units and all that sort of thing. So I think one of the key things that would need to happen in terms of getting the community involved is the authority willing to take on a soft leadership role, about sort of what is best practice in terms of community engagement and getting people involved and having a level of agency, and what is wise practice. There's a difference in the two, in that best practice suggests there's some overall guideline that is best, whereas wide practice actually says, well, we need to understand the context of that particular problem, and that's particularly important. Wise practice would be particularly important given there's 50 First Nations people in the basin, so we probably need to have that contextualised, how you engage those First Nations people. But it's not just First Nations that have wise practice. You can think of a whole range of other issues such as water quality varying right across the basin and so on. So yeah, I think it's that level of being able to take on soft leadership.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to add? No? Okay, we're going to direct some questions now to our panellists from our viewers. So viewers, if there is anyone out there that would like to specifically ask a question to one of our panellists, please just pop that in the Q&A, which you'll find just on the top screen. And if you could please just highlight the name of the person that you're directing your comment to. We'll have 5 minutes of Q&A time if there is anyone out there who would like to direct a question to our panellists. I'll just ask panellists, can you also see the Q&A on your screens? Yes? Okay. Has anyone got anything coming through? Yes, Michelle?
Bernie, just to add on to that last conversation about, you know, one thing that we could adopt or MDBA could adopt. It has been said, but I think the importance of a flexible framework means that there can be these iterative, more locally based problem definitions and then processes to work through possible solutions. So if that isn't in the next basin plan, it's not really able to be an adaptive plan. And we've seen the limitations of the plan that we've worked with to date. So for me, that flexibility is the key.
Indeed.
Which is going to be really challenging given, you know, the pull from different sectors and, you know, people's need for certainty on one hand. But I think we all have to trust the value of building flexibility in, provided there's some development to community of decision-making processes at that scale.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Kevin?
I noticed in one of the questions is, could the creation of a set of KPIs and letting councils and regions develop projects to meet them ever work? Would it ever work? Nicola Thomas has raised that question, but I think the question is, and more importantly, if they create a plan, what are their measures and how are they measuring it? Because a lot of the research the MDBA and DQ do is environmental and culturally based. There's not a lot of evidence about the economic benefit. There's not a lot of evidence about how they measure that economic benefit and what that means to the plan or to the communities it affects. And I think to be able to actually be accountable to that as an organisation is a major consideration, because the balance is what they've said is out of whack. How are they going to demonstrate a balanced plan? And that to me is accountability. And I think Andrew McConville keeps talking about a balanced plan. Well, what is it and how are you going to be accountable to it? And we're happy to be accountable to it. We're happy to take money for projects, and communities across the basin would be more than happy to be in sync with that and in lockstep with that.
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. Does anyone else want to add to that? No. Okay. Well,
only Bernie to say that, you know, clear rules are clearly part of building strong collaboration, because if everyone understands the rules of the game, then that builds trust, and that's the basis for cooperation and collaboration.
Absolutely. Indeed. Is there any other questions out there from our viewers that you may wish to have answered? Have new from Margot, yeah. Is there a risk in devolution to communities that communities carry the responsibility for things outside their control? Yes, Sarah?
I think there is, and I think part of that is what Michael was alluding to before as well, about clear rules of engagement. And so having a clear understanding of the scope of which communities can solve their questions in. So one of them, we could come up with a great set of projects that costs $15 billion, which government will not fund, perhaps, because they're actually too busy with the cost of living crisis and a whole lot of other things. So I think we have to be given, as Michelle said, some clear flexibility and adaptability to allow these things to happen. But we also need to know the rules of engagement, which is, you know, what the financial pressures might be, or the opportunities, how we might leverage other sources of funding, what are the governance structures, who will be the deliverer, and things like that. So that'll have sometimes a better chance at mitigating some of those things out of your control. Whether they get funded is one of them. But there will always be things out of our control where communities want long-term water security in a very challenging environment that we have in Australia that is likely getting hotter and drier. And so our understanding of what water security too may have to possibly shift and be redefined.
Great, thank you, Zara. Edwina?
I think we are making some assumptions at this stage, summarising from what everybody's mentioned earlier. I think Shari put it very well from the perspective of local governments, where they're already wearing that responsibility from the community, and that goes similarly for a lot of land care and producer groups, irrigator groups, community-based groups that are seen to have had a say, to have been consulted on behalf of the community, and then not achieved, the outcomes that they wanted. So that sense that of being legislated into a deliberative role rather than a consultation role, and adequate resourcing to ensure that the that participation is well informed as the other participants in the room is an assumption I think that we've made coming towards the end. It's certainly a risk, but I think it's a far greater risk not having a seat at the table, or having a seat at the table that can be turned into a narrative nice to see, rather than substantial deliberative input.
Thank you, Edwina. Yes, Jonathan?
Yeah, when I heard your question first read out, I was thinking, so does that mean that they would be blamed for not achieving something that's outside their possible scope of work because they just don't have the power or ability or legislative control of that? But then I thought about the nature of the risk in terms of I'm aware of YACTAC, which are the community group that work along the Anko Creek. And they've done marvellous work, fantastic work, removing willows and making sure that stream is great. But now the problem is carp, which is outside their control. And I've been around the table with them, and I can sense their immense frustration that they just haven't got there. So I'm sort of unpacking that risk element to say, well, actually, when a community group does get involved and they don't have the power to actually achieve a particular goal towards the end because it has multiple components, it can lead to frustration and disillusionment. Just like along the Barker, the First Nations people there get with their ethic and belief of caring for country, the disillusionment they get when they see the fish kills and the thing that affects their well-being and their own internal spirit really affects me as a person. So there is a risk, but it's the nature of the risk. I think it's important to think about.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Chris?
Yeah, I think I sort of go back to why are we even having this conversation? And I think ultimately the goal is, we want healthy waterways and catchments and good land management decisions and communities that are thriving and prosperous, all those sorts of things. And there is an assumption in this whole conversation, which I thoroughly buy into, that if communities and stakeholders and governments can work together in better ways, they will come up with better decisions that are more enduring and are able to be implemented and will lead to better future, not only short term, but for future generations. So that's the opportunity we've got. And every opportunity comes with some risk. So there's a risk of not doing anything, and then there's a risk of, you know, with any decision, are we going the right way? Have we made the right choices? What if? All of that. So I think these changes in the way we make decisions, the thinking about local governance, it's got to deliberate and think about all these things. What are the risks? What are the opportunities? And how are we going to choose between different ways that we could go? So that's why this isn't like an overnight thing, as Michael said. There needs to be a process to think about all of this and to actually deliberate on it together, and to think through all these issues and to come up with things that we can test and try and go, you know, that worked, that didn't, and it may be things are suitable for one type of issue or different issues. It's all going to be context dependent. But I think there's a real risk if we do nothing and keep working on the way we are.
Thank you, Chris. Indeed. I think to tidy that up, I think there is that real general consensus that we know that something needs to change. We know that local voices need to be heard, and we know that our communities need to be empowered. And I really do thank you all for your input in today's session. It really sparks a lot of great questions and hopefully a fair bit of action moving forward. So that brings us to the end of today's session. On behalf of the One Basin CRC, I'd like to sincerely thank our panellists for sharing their expertise and insights, and of course thank all of you for joining us and for your thoughtful questions and contributions to the discussion. If you'd like to find out more about our full series of online panel sessions covering topics relevant to plan review, I'd encourage you to visit the One Basin Review Hub on our website. The address and QR code are on screen now. It's onebasin.com.au. /onebasin/review/hub. The Review Hub has information on all upcoming sessions and recordings of all sessions, including today's. It will be made available there in the upcoming weeks, so please do save the link and revisit anything you'd like to review. Finally, I want to let you know about our next session, which will be held tomorrow, and it's called Maximising Economic Outcomes Under an Increasingly Variable Climate in the Murray-Darling Basin, chaired by Professor Neville Crossman. We hope to see you there. Thank you again, and thank you everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day.